Hey baddies! Today we talk with Lucas Wilson, who is the author of the book Shame, Sex, Attraction: Survivors' Stories of Conversion Therapy. This is a book of curated stories from folks who, exactly as the title states, have survived conversion therapy. We start the conversation by hearing what exactly is conversion therapy and also learning about conversion ideology, which is the underlying belief system behind conversion therapies. Then Lucas gets into the history of conversion therapy and how efforts to erase queer folks is by definition genocidal. Lucas explains how shame is core to these practices, and he tells his own story of conversion therapy. Finally, we get to hear about certain stories that stood out to Lucas from the collection. Your bad homework for this week is to go ahead and leave a review for the podcast. That's especially helpful if you're using Apple Podcasts. The reviews can bring more attention to the podcast. So go ahead and go do that. Okay, bye.
If conversion practitioners had their way, queers would not exist.
Okay. 1, 2, ready, go.
Welcome to the Called to Be Bad podcast. My name is Mariah Martin, and I feel called to be bad. It turns out I'm not the only one. Join us as we dig into all things bad, scandalous, deviant, the stuff that makes good church folks squirm in the sanctuary. Why? Well, because sometimes the scandalous is spiritual, deviant is divine, and bad is beautiful. Say yes to the call, and let's see what holy trouble we get into today. Well, welcome, Lucas, to the Called to Be Bad podcast. It's good to have you here.
It's great to be here.
So this is Lucas Wilson, and he is the author of the book Shame, Sex, Attraction: Survivors' Stories of Conversion Therapy. But before we dive into that whole world, I'm curious, Lucas, what all you are drinking today.
Well, we brought 2 drinks. Right now, where I am, it's 1 o'clock, and so it's kind of appropriate, but maybe kind of not. And so, whatever. We're called to be bad, right? So,
yes,
I'm drinking coffee here, but I also brought this because I'm a trashy girl. A Budweiser.
Amazing.
Yeah. So I hate to say it, but I really do like Budweisers. I know a lot of people think that's gross, and it probably is, but I'm a fan, so here we are.
No, I love this, and I love this because so my dad lives in Colorado, I'm in Indiana, it's far away. But whenever he comes and visits, he helps me do different projects. It's very, very, very traditional dad and daughter stuff. And so normally we'll be working on my chicken coop. But whenever we do projects, we have to have shitty college beer. That is the law. We have to have shitty college beer. And so we go and get Budweiser or whatever. I don't even know the names.
Pabst?
I just look at
Would Pabst be one?
Yeah. I just look for the cheapest, the shittier the better. And there was one time we were working on the chicken coop, and I was like, I forgot the shitty college beer. I have to go get it. So I drove over to CVS as fast as I could, and I was on my way back, and as I was running back with my shitty college beer, I dropped it everywhere. No. And so they started exploding, and so I'm I'm shotgunning, this is your good Mennonite pastor, right? I'm shotgunning beer, and I run back in the back gate, and I just shove one at my dad, so he starts shotgunning, because we can't waste it. We can't waste this good, terrible beer.
It's a daughter and father bonding moment, right? Just
exactly.
Shotgunning beers near the chicken coop. I love that there's a chicken coop involved. That's my favorite part of that
there
story.
has to be. Yeah, I put so much blood, sweat, and tears and shitty beer into that chicken coop. Anyway, so all of that to say, I am very much applaud your Budweiser and coffee. Oh yes, well, I guess this is the time to show mine. I had to do my best queer mug.
Yeah,
this is from my friend Scott Litweiler, and I love this mug, and it's beautiful. And I don't know if I've told this story on the podcast before, but I made the mistake of putting this in the microwave. But if you look close, there's metal. It's gold flecks in there, and so it started sparking, and I was like, oh no, that's not what we want. So I got it out really quickly. Anyway, so 2 morals of the story. Always have shitty college beer when you are working on chicken coops, and don't put certain mugs in the microwave.
Yeah, there's gonna be fireworks.
So are you gonna
otherwise.
do like 1 sip beer, 1 sip coffee, like during our conversation? Is that how it's gonna go?
I wonder if that's is that
legal?
Is that in my best interest? I don't know. Yeah, I might. We'll see. Right now we're gonna start with the coffee. Maybe we'll end with the beer. A little dessert.
Yeah, perfect. Yes.
Yeah.
So like by the end of it, you're gonna shotgun the beer, right? Is that what?
Yeah. My chicken coop's just over here, so it kind of all works. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. Lord have mercy. So let's just start with like the definition. Like, what is conversion therapy?
Yeah. So to give a quick definition of conversion therapy, I mean, at its most basic definition, conversion therapy is the attempt to change an individual's sexual orientation and or gender identity and or gender expression. And so it's, and oftentimes we use the term conversion therapy when perhaps the better term to use, which, I talk about in the intro, is conversion practices. But of course, people don't, if I said conversion practices, people would not necessarily think, oh, conversion therapy. They might think, oh, just Christians in general. And so I, of course, for the title, use conversion therapy just because it's more recognizable. And so conversion practices, there's a whole bunch of conversion practices, right? Like it could be anything from talk therapy, which was my experience, to aversion therapy, to electroshock therapy and beyond. So there are multiple different practices and a lot of different sort of, ways that one might practice conversion therapy. And, for conversion therapy, it's undergirded by what we call conversion ideology. Conversion ideology is the belief that queer people are in need of change, that they are sick, that they are degenerate, that they are defective, that they are broken, incomplete, and beyond, right? So insert your negative descriptor. That's us. Yeah. So it's this belief that, that queers are not actually queers, but that queers are, again, they wouldn't use the term queer because they don't believe that we exist. They believe that everyone in the world is a heterosexual, whether it be, latent or, active heterosexual. So they believe that, they say, Luke, you're a heterosexual, you're just struggling with same-sex attraction, which is where the title of the book comes from. We can get more into that in a second. But it's the idea that I need to be changed because what I am is not good. And so it's working in concert with, the idea or sort of the practice of heteronormativity, right? So it's pushing me in the direction of heteronormativity that really, for a lot of conversion therapy, it's the idea that if only I am to act like a straight man, and through a number of conversion practices and through, performance really at its core, it's asking queers to perform a brand of heteronormativity, or for me, masculinity, for a lesbian, femininity, so as to habituate that performance of gender, and that over time, that's not just going to be a performance of gender and acting like, what we're not, but it's going to be over time that we become that. So, if I'm presenting a certain brand of machismo and I'm out there playing sports or doing carpentry or whatever the hell they want me to do, that over time, if I to act like that, I'm not just acting like that, I am that. And so this is what conversion therapy is in a lot of cases. There are other forms of conversion therapy, and there's this is more of like the reparative model, but there's also the addiction model, right? That they understand queerness or sex in general to be an addiction, and to cure an addiction is through a 12-step recovery process, or maybe like a 10-step depending on the program. And so it's a way of pushing people to be what they're not, so as for them to become what they're not. And of course, we know conversion therapy does not work. We know that it's not therapy. We know that there's no conversion. We know that it's a bogus sham, that it's, based on pseudoscience. It's not real science that's backing this up. They have, a few studies that are by conversion therapists that are not legitimate, that they use to sort of claim or back up their claims. But of course, the rest of the world knows, and I now know, years later after going through it, that of course this doesn't work. And so no surprise there. But that's what we're talking about when we're talking about conversion therapy or conversion practices.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a part in your introduction where it said that these early conversion therapy, in quotes, practices, once there was some like shoddy science came out, they like really latched onto that, which is so interesting, because you'd think that same like stream of Christianity like the science, it wouldn't really matter.
No, but you're right though. Even that, like the idea that like so many Christians are so wary of science and professionals and anyone with a brain in their head. And so but you're right. Like to give a little bit of a background of conversion therapy. Obviously, conversion therapy has been going on for a while, but if we're to think about the long term, conversion therapy actually didn't start in religious contexts, even though it's largely and predominantly today a religious practice. Or at least like a quasi-religious practice. And so, if we think about, 50, 60, well, more than that, I always think it's like 2000. I forget when we are. Anyway, it's 2025, here we are. So it was originally in a lot of ways, a medical practice, right? It was something that like doctors would perform and try to change, queer folks' sexualities or gender identities or expressions. And then when we hit the 70s, again, that's wildly like oversimplifying the history before that, but it was in a secular context for much of the history. When we get to the 70s is really when you have a number of religious organizations cropping up. Specifically in California, there were also some in Australia, but these organizations were a group of queers who did not want to be queer. And they wanted to change, and so they started creating these groups. And so these groups then started connecting with other groups, and then they started forming different, networks, which eventually in 1976, that's when Exodus International is formed. And then beyond that, there are a bunch of other ministries or churches or even universities, and we'll talk more about that from my experience. These different organizations that start cropping up that are using conversion therapy as a way to change individuals within their communities. And so once the 80s hit, you have, like you were saying, these like researchers, quote unquote, who start lending their research and themselves. And again, research is everything's in quotation marks. Whenever I talk about any of this, it's always like quote, quote, quote.
Right.
That's evangelicalism. So, these researchers, show up, and if someone like Elizabeth Moberly, right, that she shows up, she offers her, Christian therapy or sort of Christian psychological approach to conversion practices. Because before that, it was, yes, there were psychological principles sort of incorporated, but it was largely theological. But more and more, again, as the 80s hit and then the 90s, there are more of these like pseudo researchers who show up and they're saying like, here's actual evidence-based research to back up the claim that you can in fact change. And so these researchers loved these organizations, like these conversion therapy organizations, ex-gay organizations as they were often called. They loved them because they bought their books. And then the people who were buying the books loved the researchers, again, quote unquote, because they were offering credibility to their argument, right? And so then that snowballs into the 90s and then 2000s. And then, of course, more and more studies are actually working against conversion practices and saying, hey, this is dangerous. This is death dealing. This has really significant consequences. And that's where we are today. Not to say that there aren't conversion, therapy practice, or there's not ex-gay organizations or these sorts of efforts to change individuals. Those are still around. Obviously, conversion therapy is not a thing of the past. It is absolutely a thing of the present as well, or it's both and, should I say. And so that's where we are today. But again, it has this history behind it that, again, a lot of folks just don't know. But it's there, and we can see how this movement, and it is a movement, developed over time.
Yeah, like in your book, you talked about like the kind of what I interpreted as like the pre-Christian conversion therapy. Like there was like testicle transplants and lobotomies and like, that's just, I just can't even imagine. Well, is there anything else about like the history of conversion therapy that you want to touch on?
I think for the history, I think it's important to know the history, but it's equally important to know whatever, equally, like as if I'm measuring what's more important, what's less important, whatever. Yeah. It's important also to know that the present. And I think that, although we have this history, and it is a sordid history, it's this, really dark attack against the queer community that has been a sustained attack for decades. And that's something to always remember, that like, and that's not just within conversion therapy circles, right? If we're thinking about queer history over the past 60, 70 years, we're thinking about an attack from all angles, right? Not just from the church, but from the government, right? We're from, educational systems, from, the legal system and beyond. But a huge amplifier of this homophobia and transphobia really is coming from religious communities. And, if you look at, like take your pick of almost any like sort of like prominent figure within the new Christian right over the past 50, 60 years, they're always going to be talking about these things. And by and large, like I can't really think of anyone who would diverge from this. Maybe I could stand correct. I could be wrong. Let's just go there.
Yeah.
Dear Lord.
Yeah.
Language is not my thing, apparently. No, I could be wrong.
Says the writer.
But what I would say is that that I don't know of one prominent new Christian right figure who would not be in favor of conversion practices, right? Wow. Because oftentimes this is not framed as conversion therapy. It's not framed as reparative therapy or change therapy. They don't call it that. They don't also even, I think, conceptualize it like that. They think that, oh, God is, able to do anything and everything. So therefore, God can change someone's deviant, sinful, according to their standards, gender identity, expression, or sexuality. And so, this is something that is not contained just to like a few churches. This is something that is pervasive across a number of religious traditions, particularly those that are conservative. And this is a sustained attack against queers that happens today. So this history maps onto the history of queers in general, and the religious component of it. And again, like the even before that, the sort of quote unquote scientific research before, which there's a lot of research on those the studies that happened before the 1970s. And it, the American Psychological Association, for one, has this report about this specifically, and how they discredit all of these studies, and they go like study by study and talk about, how these studies were just simply not effective, and there were flaws and methodological issues and problems. So all this to say, there is the quote unquote scientific, which is really pseudoscientific, approach to this, as well as the religious, aspect. These things together have created a shitstorm, to put it in the best sort of academic language I can put it.
Terms.
That has led to the death-dealing effects, and in some cases, literal death-dealing effects of queer folks throughout the past, again, half century.
Mm-hmm. And in your introduction, you something shifted in my brain when you named this work as genocidal. I was like, oh my gosh, can you talk about how that is an appropriate term for this?
Yeah. So a lot of people think probably when I use that term that it's hyperbolic, that I'm, being histrionic or sort of dramatic by calling this genocidal. But if we think of it in very basic terms, right, that if these folks had their way, talking about conversion practitioners, if conversion practitioners had their way, queers would not exist, right? Like we would not be on this planet. Queerness would not be a thing. What I do love about queers is that even if you killed all of us today, we're all going to be there in 10 years. There's going to be the next generation of queers. We don't go away. But this is by definition a genocidal intent, right? That the conversion ideology and the conversion practice, they are motivated by genocidal intent. They do not want queers to exist. And so all of these efforts are to erase us. All of these efforts are to get rid of us. Of course, they don't work. And so at the end of the day, it's not going to happen. None of this is going to come to fruition. However, the fact that there is intent for us to not exist should be alarming, right? This is something that I think people need to recognize. And this is also not an original idea. I always like to cite my sources. This is actually an idea coming from Christine Robinson and Sue Spivey. I was on Zoom a few days ago with Christine. Christine and I are doing a chapter together about homosexuality as an addiction for an edited collection. But this is their idea, and they lay out in their article on the topic, step by step, how this is in fact a genocide, right? Pardon me, an attempt, or this is the intent for a genocide.
Sure.
Because again, if you think about cultural genocide, if we're thinking about, for instance, for indigenous folks in North America as one example of many, it's not always that that people are literally murdering or killing these individuals, and of course that happened too. But if you think about, in Canada, the 60s scoop, right, where all these kids were taken from their families and put into white, Canadian families. Of course, Indigenous folks are Canadian, but they put them into these white families, and these kids lost their culture. And that is, again, that's a cultural genocide, what was happening. And so here, when we're talking about queers and we're talking about conversion practices and conversion ideology, all of this is rooted in a desire for a group of people, the LGBTQ community, to not exist. And by definition, that's a genocidal intent.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not only harm to queer bodies, but also to culture, like you were saying. Oh, yeah. And I'll be honest, I really did, thinking about conversion therapy and your book, I really thought it was a thing of the past. I did not realize that it still exists today. And yeah, the stories were powerful. Like I found myself, I was reading and I was like, all of a sudden I was like, oh, I need to put this down. Like I was getting worked up. I was getting agitated, like, because the stories are so powerful and just like, my empathetic heart, like I was just like wanted to like go to war for these folks who were put in these situations. And like in the intro, you talked about how these are my words, not yours, but like basically like shame is the weapon of choice for these practitioners, therapists, quote unquote, and how folks were made to feel, yeah, like they were worthy of hell, basically, and that who they were was wrong and broken. And yeah, do you want to talk a bit about how shame plays the role in these stories?
Yeah. So to zoom out, just shame in general, when we're talking about conversion therapy or conversion practices, shame is really a big motivating factor, if not the biggest motivating factor for why people even go into conversion therapy, right? If you didn't feel ashamed of yourself, you wouldn't need conversion therapy. And so it's what brings people in, but it's also what's exacerbated and what's, amplified within these folks because of conversion therapy, right? Conversion therapy produces shame as well. So it's both that which brings people in and also that which is the product of conversion therapy. And actually, a recent Canadian study talked about the number one consequence of conversion therapy is shame. The number one cited consequence, or what survivors identified as a consequence. So shame is really central, and that's of course the title of, in part, the title of the book, Shame, Sex, Attraction. It's a play on same-sex attraction, which within conversion therapy circles and also within like evangelical circles, right? It's this idea that queers aren't queer, they just struggle with same-sex attraction. Away again,
Yeah.
saying you're a straight person, you just struggle with something. It's something like a sickness or an addiction or that which is outside of you, not you. And of course that affords these folks the delusion that they're able to then therefore change an individual, right? So if they're not queer, it's just something that's affecting them. Well, we can get to the root cause of what's affecting this, and then remove it and sort of get rid of it or erase it or cure it or whatever, however they conceptualize it. So this idea of same-sex attraction, again, it's where I was always told, I'm not gay, I just struggle with same-sex attraction. But of course, to make that argument, you need to feel ashamed of yourself. Why? Because if you didn't feel ashamed of yourself, you wouldn't understand it like that. You'd understand it as, oh, I'm just gay, or queer or lesbian or trans or whatever. So shame, sex, attraction is, again, that's what we're talking about. That's why the title is Shame, Sex, Attraction, because shame is central to all of this. And almost all of us were told we weren't queer. We were just struggling with same-sex attraction. So within the stories themselves, though, it is the unifying thread. Like every single story, you can see how these individuals feel ashamed, right? And even the first story that, of course, you read, Sniffing the Gay Away, it starts with this guy who his conversion therapist says, like, you just need to get like shit and smell, like literal shit. And she says dog shit. Like, use this and smell this every time that you feel tempted. It's a form of aversion therapy, right? It's doing something that you then associate with queerness or your sexuality, and that you've become grossed out by it. In this case, like this like really disgusting way of pushing someone in the direction of being disgusted by their sexuality. And so this story, like that's how the collection opens, with this form of aversion therapy. And that man, like when he had this, when he was told to do this, you wouldn't do that unless you felt so lowly about yourself and you felt so ashamed of yourself, right? And so that's just one example of the 17 stories included, that gives you really sort of insight into how shame leads people to these practices, and leads people not just to these practices, but practices that are so dehumanizing, right? And so that debase the individual to such an extent that they're literally sitting there smelling shit, right? Like that's one example of many. And so the stories all have different, expressions of shame and different representations of shame, but shame is certainly that which unites all of them.
Yeah. And not only just like getting a whiff of the shit, like it was like you had to smell it until you were gagging and like on the brink or throwing up. Like it was like that. And like just the desperation and the desire to be right or fixed or good that leads you to like, yes, I am going to try this. I will do whatever it takes to be seen as normal or good or not deviant, etc.
Well, that's it. It's like they want you to feel that disgusting about yourself, right?
Yeah.
To the point of vomiting, right? And when you think about vomiting, like what is vomiting? Vomiting is when something is coming close to you or within you that you want out, You want that gone, right? Like it's a physiological response, and it's also in some cases a psychological response to certain things or certain, you know, if it's not sickness, but also just like disgust. When you're disgusted, it's literally like a projection of this out of your body and away from me kind of thing. And that's how these folks think of queerness. They're so disgusted by it. They want us to be so disgusted by it to the point of literally vomiting. And of course, that's not everyone's story. And thank God that's not my story. And thank God, you know, that's not everyone had that happen to them. But even though that might be, again, a really sort of viscerally disturbing story in comparison to some others, at least on the surface, all of what everyone included in the collection, those who undergo conversion therapy more generally, all of us have we're subject to teachings and practices that made us feel so disgusting about ourselves that this is where we would end up. Like I remember feeling sick to my stomach about certain things that I had done, you know, sexually when I was younger. But again, like why was I wanting to throw up over, again, you know, being attracted to men? Like this, it was, again, I wasn't smelling shit, but I was pushed to such an extent that what was so natural to me, right? It's what those who I'm, you know, men I'm attracted to, that afterwards I felt so gross about myself, I felt like vomiting. Again, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not trying to play the comparison game or say like it was just as bad for me. It's just to show you the commonalities between this and the underlying similarities, that we are made to feel disgusted about ourselves. And that's what conversion therapy is predicated upon. The idea that we are disgusting. That's what conversion ideology, you know, says. We're gross and we need to change, and we should change, because look how, you know, it leads to consequences like throwing up, or, you know, it leads to consequences of disgust. Why do we feel that? Because we're made to feel that, right? We're not struggling with same-sex attraction. We are those who are made to struggle with our attraction to the same sex. And I think that's what the book's trying to reveal.
Yeah. Yeah, and you make the distinction between guilt and shame. You want to touch on that just a little bit?
Yeah. So if you think about it in the court of law, you know, let's say I stole a chocolate bar. I'm in the court of law. I get my, you know, slap on the hand. You stole that chocolate bar. You shouldn't have done it. Oh gosh. Okay. I get, you know, I don't know, a year in jail. Let's put me in jail for a while. That's for that specific, you know, action, that specific transgression. I did that one thing that was bad. And in the eyes of the court, I'm bad for that, not for other things, because I didn't get tried for other things, or I didn't, you know, they don't see me as bad. They see just the thing that I did as bad. So I feel guilty. And according to the court of law, I'm guilty of this one, you know, transgression. The difference between guilt and shame is not that I've done something bad, and that's what guilt would be, but that I am bad, right? So it's where, you know, when it comes to shame is where that guilt turns inwards, and that shame and that guilt turns those negative feelings about what I've done are not just specific individual discrete actions. These are now, it's a feeling that I attach to myself as the one who did them, because perhaps, you know, and at least in my case, I felt shame once I realized that these weren't just individual actions. It wasn't like I was like, oh, I looked at porn here, or oh, I masturbated here, oh, I looked at that man on the street, whatever. It was where I said, oh, I keep doing this. This isn't just like that action there, and there. It's a pattern, because it's a function of who I am. So that guilt and that negativity turned inwards, and I felt like I'm bad. Not that I did something bad, but I myself am bad. That's the difference between guilt and shame. It's where you've done something bad versus you are bad. And I can think of, you know, I remember for me, and a lot of people talk about, you know, I actually, you know, I had this like video article that they had, like an article, but there were also videos embedded that I had done. And someone was commenting, some troll was commenting, saying like, oh God, you know, I was talking about the things that I was told to do, or the things that I, you know, conversion therapy required of me. And he was like, oh, it doesn't sound that bad, kind of thing. And saying like, you're just whatever. And there's some asshole somewhere in the world who had some like AJ744000 kind of name, you know, like very under the radar. Yeah, one of those cuties. So I remember thinking like, because on the surface, it doesn't sound like what I was saying things like I was told to sit a certain way. I was told to talk a certain way. I was told to do certain things certain ways. And that's what I chose to talk about in that video. Of course, there's more to what conversion therapy is, but that's what I chose to talk about. And he said, it's not that bad. So, you know, I thought about that for a while, because again, like, you know, you always learn, you don't read the comments. So I learned my lesson that day, but I did think about it. And what I was realizing at the time was that those, and also before and also after, but again, this was just really sort of came to the surface in that moment when I was thinking about what he said, that doesn't sound that bad. But again, the consequences of conversion therapy for a lot of us are not within the moment of conversion therapy. It's not like when I'm in that room, this is the consequence and this is why it's terrible. For me, the consequences came later. And so when I was in conversion therapy at Liberty, and I can talk more in depth about, my experience there, but I'll give you, when I was there, every time I met with this pastor, his name was Pastor Dane Emmerich, every time I met with him, he would, Emmerich would make me feel almost better about myself, because it was like, he tried his best, and he actually talks about this, and he's talked about this publicly, that he would try to separate guilt and shame. He would say, like, guilt is productive, guilt is good, guilt is from the Holy Spirit, and that shame is bad, and, it doesn't result in anything good. And despite his intentions to separate guilt from shame and make those of us who he, practiced conversion therapy on, feel better about ourselves, the thing is that over time, that shame that he was trying to get rid of comes back. And also, what I mean by that is, when I would meet with him, we would talk about, a number of things. And part of those things, some of the things we would talk about were my victories and my slip-ups. So my slip-ups were times I gave into temptation. My victories were times that I overcame temptation. I'm like, I went for a run instead of, looking at porn, whatever. So he said to me, so he would, celebrate those moments that I had overcome temptation, and then be like, yeah, you gave it to temptation here, but let's keep our eyes on the prize. Let's focus on Jesus and, keep running. So I would feel almost like a sense of absolution. I would feel almost like, what I think a lot of Protestants think of when they think of like Catholics and going into like, confessional. It's like, I always felt like I was confessing my sins and, moving forward. Obviously, us Protestants or, Protestants don't really believe in that, but it felt similar to that. And so I always felt better about myself when I would leave that room, because, I have been told for so long that, being gay or homosexuality or struggling with same-sex attraction is terrible. And if you act on it, it's terrible. But he would almost make me feel better in the moment. The problem is that when I left the school, when I left Liberty, I went home to Ontario, where I'm from. And I was in grad school. And I still remember there was this one night, I was standing over the kitchen sink in my split level apartment. It was like all the lights were off except for the light above the sink, washing dishes after dinner. I was about to go visit my buddy at the pub. And I was just standing there talking to God. And I started thinking about how things just haven't changed, right? That I'm still gay. I still struggle, quote unquote, with same-sex attraction. Nothing's changing. And I thought to myself, I was like, well, I met with Dane for 4 years. I have read my Bible. I have, memorized scripture. I have fasted. If you count up the number of weeks that I used to fast, it's like literally months of not eating. This idea that if only I'm to practice the spiritual sort of, the spiritual practice of fasting, that I will be able to focus on God and overcome these same-sex attractions. So, I'd done all these things. I had prayed, I'd fasted, all this kind of stuff. And yet there was no change. And I was like, God, that I want to change. Or again, had been made to believe I wanted to change. But I want to change. That I don't want this. Like, you're the giver of all good gifts. And if I'm not changing and you do want me to change, then obviously you're not the problem, because according to this cosmology, God's perfect. But therefore that means I'm the problem. And when you see yourself as a problem, that's where that guilt is no longer, I did that bad thing over there, there, and there, and there. But it's now, I'm the issue. I'm the problem. I need to be fixed. But again, I'm not being fixed. Nothing's changing. So that's where the shame really sort of like kicked in. And it was that shame that turns into self-hatred. And then over time, again, you see yourself in such negative terms. You see yourself as, again, a problem. You see yourself, as disgusting. And again, I did before, but again, those times where I was feeling alleviated of that guilt, I felt, better about myself. But then when you don't have that anymore, and then you are now living in a world where you're feeling like you're all by yourself, and then eventually that pressure and that hatred and that shame is so heavy that you need to do something and to change. And for me, that was eventually just coming out, and that was me eventually just like working through that shame and saying like, let me figure out why I felt like this. And that wasn't God making me feel like that. That was more so, I don't know, every Christian making me feel like that, and perhaps society writ large. But all this to say is that for me, that's where the violence of conversion therapy really came in. It was the after effects and, the fruits of conversion therapy, post-conversion therapy, that really made clear the distinction between guilt and shame for me in an experiential sense, in a personal sense. And I saw it firsthand in the months and years after conversion therapy.
Yeah. So, you curated all these stories Are there any in particular that you will carry with you, like any pieces of these stories that especially like stuck out to you? I mean, other than starting strong with the like having to smell dog feces. It's just horrible.
Yeah. There are a few. There's some that are personal and some that are, I think of Nathan Z, his story, Away and Away. For his story, his conversion practitioners were his parents, specifically his mom, and who was a part of what he describes as a Chinese cult. And so with that story, it's, oh my goodness, it's like, what's the word? Like hauntingly well written. It almost reaches a level of poetry in how he articulates himself. But he uses repetition as a literary device throughout the story to really emphasize the shame, the self-hatred, and also just his experience with his parents. And reading that story, he always says like what he didn't do or what he how do I say? He uses negation, right? He's like, I never wrote about this. I never wrote about this. And he keeps repeating. And then he sometimes says, oh, I wrote this, but then I never wrote about this. And the way that he repeats it, it almost feels it's like it's oppressive by the end, like his use of this phrase over and over and over. And it gives you, again, stylistically, an entrance into the world for him, his conversion experience or conversion therapy experience, of the suffocation that is felt within these spaces. And you feel tight. You feel like you can't breathe reading the story. But again, when you are undergoing conversion therapy and when you are thinking about the consequences, there's that sense of suffocation, that sense of like you're in jail and you can't move and you can't get out of it and there's nothing you can do. And you feel that intensity, that affective response to what's happening. So that story, I think, stylistically really gives voice to what a lot of folks experience when they experience conversion therapy. The one story that really stands out to me as something that the reason why it stands out is because it brought up something within me that I forgot about. It revivified like a memory of mine that I hadn't really thought about in years. And again, I think your brain, why do you forget some of these things? Because your brain's trying to protect itself, right? It's trying to say like, let's not think about that. We don't need to think about that. And that just sort of puts it to sleep or buries it. And again, obviously a lot of these things come out in weird ways and your traumas will express themselves no matter what, whether it be through your body or, otherwise, your dreams. But with specifically his story, there's one story that he writes about his experience in this traveling band, this Christian band that goes to different churches across Australia, and they're, performing and singing and playing music, whatever. And he wrote, there's the whole story, but the part that stood out to me was the shower scene. He talks about showering. And if you think about how simple showering is, right, it's something that all of us do daily, probably, hopefully, but we all shower. And it's such a sort of like a commonplace, like quotidian thing that we do. And I forgot about how much anxiety showering caused for me when I was both in high school and in university and even a little bit beyond undergrad. Because showering, for us, we were always told, and we felt it, we believed it, that it was this moment of like, you have to watch out because you're going to be tempted to masturbate. And, if you wash yourself too long, then there's the possibility you might become, what's the word, excited, and then you're going to masturbate. And to be honest, like, yeah, like when you're like a hormonal teenager, yeah, that's exactly what happens. But you were made to feel anxious about this. And it was like looking back at like the number of things, and this is even, again, it's not specific to conversion therapy. This is like very much part of Christianity in general. So many things that are really just like, who cares? This is like such a inconsequential thing that are made to have such like immense weight and significance, like showering, that you're like terrified to shower because you're scared that you're going to sin. Right. There are things like, where you're walking down the street and, you didn't witness to someone and you felt like, oh, God, what did I do? I should have done that. Like Jesus gave me the opportunity to talk to that person. I should have talked to them about God and I didn't. Like all these like little things that are just so stupid. Right. They're so stupid. They're so inconsequential that become super consequential, and they shouldn't. But this is what these ways of thinking, these systems of thought and these high control religious groups do.
Yes.
And what conversion therapy does, it pushes you to weigh and measure every little thing and scrutinize everything and to think, oh, it all has eternal significance. And if I screw up here, well then who knows what the consequence is down there. So much of evangelicalism is just like this inverted world of morality, right? Where what most people would think to be a good thing within the evangelical tradition or traditions, is considered bad. It's this inversion of like what we think of to be right and good and bad and evil, whatever. And I think that that's evangelicalism. Within that world, it's a different moral system. And it's like upside down world. And so when you get out of it and you're like, oh shoot, like so much of that is just so, again, either damaging or just honestly flat out stupid. Like it's such an anti-intellectual tradition, but it's also an anti-moral system, right? Like it's against like so much of what we would hopefully understand to be moral. And within that world, like they just have a different understanding of what is good, which allows them to do such horrible things like, for instance, conversion therapy.
Yeah, which is exactly, I'm getting worked up here, but that is exactly like my point in starting the Called to Be Bad podcast, is like to explore that, like why we define things as good as bad. And like in that process, you are also learning that your desires are good, that you can trust yourself and your desires, and that is not bad or worthy of hell, etc., etc.
Isn't that a crazy idea that, I mean, for those of us who were within this world, that we were taught not to trust ourselves, like any like gut instinct or sort of like, visceral response to things, it had to be weighed and measured against this system that again was really in a lot of ways just an upside down and, inversion of morality. And for us, like we were taught not to trust ourselves. And I'm not saying that like I am the gospel truth or that I am, I know it all, or I'm the best person out there. I think I've got a lot of room for improvement, but I do think that there was so much within that world that I knew was wrong on like a visceral level, but was told it was right. And I mean, even just thinking about homosexuality, right? I remember I used to say to my friend, my really good friend at the time, we would go for these like long walks, smoke cigars, and like drink beer. And so we would
was
talk
it
about
Budweiser?
This.
Was it shitty college beer?
You know what? I wouldn't be surprised. Although this was back in Toronto. This was we'd walk along the boardwalk and like cover our beers and whatever. And I think I probably would have been drinking Rickard's White or Rickard's Red. Those were my beers at the time. I'm not sure if they've made their way to the States, but those were my beers. And I should have been drinking Budweiser. Let's just keep it classy, right? But we would talk and I would say, and I wouldn't make this claim now, but at the time I said everything within Christianity makes sense. I would not say that now. I think there's so much that is just crazy. But at the time I said everything makes sense. The only thing I just don't understand is why I can't be gay. And he was also like, yeah, just like on an intellectual level, it doesn't make sense, but like God says it is, therefore. And that's what we would talk about. But I just think to myself, like looking back at that, like even then it was like what's the fucking problem? What's the issue? Like what about it has any negative consequence to anything, to anyone? It doesn't. And of course now, like, yeah, duh. But at the time it was just like so frustrating because I was like, that doesn't make sense. And then there were more things over time as I continued to deconstruct that I realized more and more, oh, this doesn't make sense. Oh, this doesn't make sense. Like I am so thankful for academia to get me the heck out of this world because it allowed me not just the intellectual sort of emancipation and freedom, but also the emotional, spiritual and moral, right? There's that moral sort of like, oh, I can be a good person. And in fact, I'm a better person outside of this system.
Yeah, you're a better person when you're not driven by your internalized sense of shame and brokenness and wrongness. Yeah.
And that story gave me, it sort of, again, it reignited this memory of mine that I forgot about. And I now think about it every so often. And it's like this is what that story gave me. And so I think there are a number of stories, and all stories have different parts to them that are really significant. All of them in their own way are so well done. But those two, I would say, are the two that really stand out to me in response to the question you asked.
Yeah. Now you're waking up my own memories, and it was more connected to like purity culture. But I remember like writing out "Create in me a clean heart" and like posting it to the top of my desk. So I would always look at that. So I would always, because I was convinced I had a lust problem because I had a body that had physiological responses, and it totally ruined the concept of boundaries for me, because when I like, having healthy boundaries in a relationship, because I associated that with like breaking physical boundaries, with people, and like you're saying, like just taking these totally like normal things and twisting them and making them bad and shameful, and so frustrating.
Well, even like the idea of boundaries, I think about boundaries now. And when we were within these, religious contexts, I didn't like, evangelicals have no boundaries. Like, evangelicals are like, oh, like nothing's too personal to talk about. You meet someone and within 5 minutes they told you who they voted for, they told you they have a masturbation and porn problem, and they told you that black people are the reason for half of these issues. And you're like, what? You felt so comfortable to tell me all these things. And I use that example, like the who someone voted for, the porn/masturbation addiction, and how black people are the issue for like half of the social problems in the US. This is an actual example of a man I met just before I left Florida. I was having a garage sale to get rid of all my stuff that I was like cleaning myself of all my things from Florida, because I hated Florida. Anyway, the moral of the story is don't ever live in Florida. But the second part is, I was leaving and this guy comes up, and I was with this garage sale. He comes up and he starts telling me all these things. And within 5 minutes, he tells me those 3 things. And I was like, dear Lord, sir, like you felt so comfortable to tell me these things. But that's exactly to the point I'm trying to make, which is evangelicals have no boundaries. They'll tell you everything and anything. And that's that. And so I think that when for those of us who had like boundary issues where we were like, well, I feel bad that I'm telling someone, no, don't do this. Meanwhile, it's like a wildly healthy boundary to be set within evangelicalism. They're like, no, you have to, you shouldn't have boundaries. Everything, confess onto your brother or whatever, like share your sins kind of thing with each other. All of this is just so evangelical. And I think that like, if we're talking about boundaries specifically, it affects so much afterwards too, right? And even for me, when I was in conversion therapy, that my conversion therapist would always touch me. And I don't mean to say like he was like, touching me erogeously, at least in an overt sense. But we would before every meeting, or when I would meet him every meeting, he would give me this big bear hug. He would also give me a big bear hug when I left. But then when we would pray, he would always put his hand either on my shoulder or on my leg. And like, it wasn't like just on my like knee. It was always, either on my knee or above my knee. And it was enough, or I was talking to someone else about this who also had this experience. It wasn't enough to be like, whoa, what the hell are you doing? But it was enough to be like, that's weird, but I don't feel comfortable enough, because again, boundaries, we didn't know how to like establish them, to say, please don't do that. Like that feels creepy. And that was like, again, that was one example of many of how boundaries were just not a thing anymore for us. And then having to learn when I left the church, not everyone wants to know every little personal detail about you, because before that, that's what you did. You just told everyone everything. And it was almost celebrated as like a virtuous thing to do, is to like be transparent and, to have no secrets or whatever, just to lay it all bare and tell about what God's done in your life and offer that testimony. Again, as an adult, I was like, it was a process to realize I need to like maybe reel it back,
Yeah, and like this encouragement to go against kind of your inner sense of boundaries and to push against that intentionally, because that is good. That is what God wants. Like I was encouraged to have accountability partners that I would tell every time I masturbated. And like, there's this innate sense of like, oh, I need to go find the person that would feel the most guilt and shame and pick them as the person, because that would be the most painful. And like the story about the person that like he had to take off a piece of clothing every time and reveal, like it would get close, like the more he would take off, the harder it would be to reveal like a certain fear or whatever. And you can tell that story a little bit better than I, but yeah.
Well, that's the thing. I think that like we were going back to the inversion of morality. Like you were pushed towards celebrating and embracing that which was most uncomfortable, because God wants you to do the uncomfortable things, right? According to this thinking, God wants you to do that which pushes you to your limit, because that's when God can expose God's glory the most. And you're like, oh my God, like listen to how manipulative that is. Listen to how abusive, like that engenders abuse, right? And the story you're talking about, this gives perhaps voice to how, because that was the story you're mentioning. It's called Psychological Striptease. And that one, Chaim Levin, he's a Jewish man who was part of a Jewish organization. But I think that what we see within conversion therapy is that like the shame and the tactics used are not exclusive to just those which are in Christian or evangelical context. Those do extend beyond and are seen in this case, a Jewish, organization's conversion practices. And so I think that like so much of this, again, is just predicated upon shame, and it's the way of pushing people into their shame without them necessarily, well, they realize it, and obviously in an embodied sense. And shame is that which sort of registers within the body even before we can think of it, right? So it's what we call pre-linguistic. It's before language. Like you feel it before you think, oh, I feel ashamed. You have that visceral sort of response. But so many of these again, religious systems, this conversion, practices, they're all connected and they're all related, and they all use similar tactics to control, to manipulate, and to homogenize and try to keep, within the family. Again, evangelicals, it's a colonizing project. Everything within evangelicalism wants it to be the same, right? It goes out into the world to change other people to become like them. It's never to celebrate diversity. In fact, it's allergic to diversity. That's why queers and white or black folks and women, like all of these points of difference, or these parts of people that make them different, they're not celebrated. Femininity and womanhood is not celebrated within the church, at least in the way that I think it should be. It's very much framed in a certain way that is oppressive. Look at purity culture as Exhibit A. Whiteness is the model for how the church operates, and to be, to not operate in a white way, that's not celebrated. No one wants that within the church. It's like they want the black gospel music, but past that, like, when do we celebrate black culture within the church? We don't, right? We're terrified of it. Like the idea that it was scary to say Black Lives Matter within so many churches, and the fact that pastors were canceled for saying that shows you that anything outside of whiteness is not to be embraced, it is to be rejected. And of course, queerness, like, do we even need to go into it? Right? There's all of these different points of difference, right? Race, sexuality, gender, everything has to be the same. And Christianity is allergic to anything outside of that. And it operates on the binary, and it's always on, right or wrong, good or evil. And they're always right and everyone else is wrong. And this is what all of these systems, and especially, again, evangelical sort of high control religious groups do, and they operate within this culture.
Yeah. So what kind of final words would you have to say to someone that kind of grew up within this high control religious system? Maybe they've experienced conversion practices, therapy moments, maybe not. What kind of words would you leave folks like that with?
Oh my God. I would say a few things. One, are we saying that they're no longer a part of this, like the churches,
yes,
or whatever they move? Okay.
Yeah. They're out and safe and
phenomenal. If they're queer, I would say plug yourself into a queer community, right? Like community is so important, and I think it shows you you're not alone. It shows you that if in fact you do have some negative backlash or residual backlash from your religious communities, like, your family is still terrible, or you're like, people are reaching out on Facebook years later saying like, hey, I'm still praying for you, you're going to hell, that kind of bullshit. When you have a community, it's those comments, those messages are not as impactful. They still impact, obviously, they still affect, but not as much. I would also say read, like, reading's cool. I would say, like, whatever your interest is, right? If in fact you're still struggling with, like, even though I don't believe that being gay is wrong, I still have some residual fear that maybe at the end of the day, it could be, what if they're right? I think that, like, there are a number of authors out there who you can read. I'm thinking of like Matthew Vines and like his book, God and the Gay Christian, Justin Lee's Torn. Like, there are a number of different texts that you can read that talk about these things. And also just being plugged into, again, like an ex-evangelical community. I think, like, it's so funny when, you and I are talking, where it's like you say something and I say something and you say something, like we were building on each other. Why? Because we remember so much of this. And when you have someone to like spitball with and talk about these things with, it just, like, the conversation never ends. We're never going to be sort of like over this. And maybe that's the definition of trauma, right? This like repetition, reenactment of our trauma, whatever it is. And I say that somewhat facetiously. But for some people it is traumatic. For me, I wouldn't identify it as like clinical trauma, but there certainly are, what my experience rhymes with trauma. At least it's a difficult, sort of thing. And I think that when you talk to other ex-evangelicals, you realize so much, and you realize, oh gosh, that wasn't just me. Oh gosh, that was a thing that is common. Oh wow, like I see, you have that critical distance and that affirmation that what you went through and what you thought about was not just you, and it was them gaslighting you, and you're now able to sort of flip the script with someone else or with others. And so my evangelical community really consists of a few people in person, but and I still feel silly saying this, like the online community, but part of that is cool, right? Like the folks I know from either Twitter or Blue Sky or Instagram, whatever, these like social media accounts that I follow, and they talk about a lot of these things. It's so fun to watch. Like Christian Nightmares, if you know Christian Nightmares, or on Blue Sky, she left X. She's now just on Blue Sky. Chrissy Stroop. This woman is just effing phenomenal. Like she's a Stanford educated trans historian, and she's just this like beautiful brain, like just what and wonderful person who talks about a lot of these things. And honestly, like reading Chrissy's work, watching stuff from Christian Nightmares and beyond, these things are so helpful. So I would say find that community, both in person and, if you are an online person, also just to look at, different fun Instagram accounts or Twitter accounts or whatever. I'd say these three things really are super life-giving and super helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Cool. Well, any final thoughts before we wrap it up?
I normally end my talk, whatever talk I give, I normally end with the idea that you have genocidal intentions or genocidal intent. But we covered that. I guess what I would say is that I didn't even touch my Budweiser, and I feel a little guilty. Talk about shame and guilt. I feel a little guilty.
But yeah, you can save it for another time. And then whenever you get that Budweiser, you're going to think of the podcast and shitty college beer. So that'll be just fine.
Today's it's Thursday. So tomorrow is when I suppose I'll drink again. So I'm going to do a cheers to you and a cheers to the podcast. And that'll be my Friday entrance into the weekend.
I love it. Cheers. Well, thank you so much, Lucas, for coming on the podcast. It's been a delight. And yeah, I'm so thankful for your work and your book and everything. And I'm excited to put this out into the world and have the baddies out there all listen to this. So
yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me. This is the same thing, a treat to chat, and let's do it again.
Yeah, sounds good.
That's all for this episode of Called to Be Bad. Keep being your bad, beautiful selves, and I will see you next time.